Very special thanks to Barrow Motors of Burnham-on-Sea in Somerset, of course, for providing the vehicle in this review. And as I always like to do, I've dropped a link to their website, their stock page, their contact page, etc. All of that good stuff that you can find right below this video in the description. So if you'd like to check out this vehicle or their other stock or get in contact with them, then of course you can find all of those details right down below. Given the nature of many of the most successful and most popular episodes of Beards and Cars, this is pretty much a vehicle that had to ultimately be featured, because vehicles such as the Jag XK, the BMW 6 Series, and various other models as well in that kind of sphere, even some outside of the GT category like super saloons, they tend to be some of my best received and most popular reviews, and it's not hard to see why. You get so much car for the money, especially here in the UK, and I've seen from comments from various ones of yourselves on episodes that in other countries value isn't necessarily quite as good as we get here on many used cars. This is a prime vehicle to add to that group. Now, the S5 is actually a car which I considered buying myself in a similar kind of time period to the Jag XK. Now, I never considered it as seriously because overall I'm not so much of an Audi guy. I don't know what it is, it's just something about that kind of styling that isn't really 100% me. It's kind of similar to how I feel about Range Rovers. I absolutely loved the SVR last year, but it's still not necessarily something I would actually buy. In the case of this S5 though, I can honestly say that of all the Audis that I've reviewed, including some iconic ones like the RS6, the RS4 Avant, and even the R8 V10 Spider, I honestly like this one more. And one of the reasons why I like it more is, simply put, it has more personality. This is the least Audi that I've driven so far, and I think it's all the better for it. This almost feels like a Jaguar if it had an Audi body on it. And I think that that is a great thing, because there are certain key advantages to this car over something like a Jag XK, which falls into the exact same kind of price bracket. It's a fantastic rival. In fact, in particular, there are probably three cars which I would put in direct competition with each other, which I've talked about. This car, the BMW 6 Series, and the Jag XK. They are fantastic rivals for bang on the same kind of prices, and each one has their own distinct advantages, and to some degree each of them kind of caters to a little bit of a different taste. Now, if I could go back in time, I would still choose the Jag over this for a couple of reasons. One of the obvious ones being the styling. The Jag appeals to me more. There are, I would say, probably three things about this car which stood out to me the most though, in terms of being really strong selling points. One of them you'll probably guess, being an Audi. Another one is a little bit surprising, and one is a very pleasant surprise which most people who have seen, or more accurately heard, an S5 on the road can probably guess as well. So let's start with that one. These sound fantastic. The 4.2 V8 in the S5 is a lovely sounding engine. Take it from someone who has owned two Maseratis and a supercharged Jag with a V8 engine, this is easily up there with those. It's a different kind of sound, but it's just as impressive. Now, the other thing which surprised me very pleasantly is something which I'm going to include an image of, and that is actually the space. The rear seat space in particular, and this is an advantage which it kind of shares with, speaking of Maserati, the Gran Turismo. The Gran Turismo has really good rear seats for a GT, especially compared to my own Jag, which basically doesn't have rear seats. It's kind of the Porsche 911 problem in that regard. This has, as you can see from the image, which I'll have doubtless included in the video, really decently sized rear space. The legroom is enough for at least shorter journeys, if not longer ones, and they actually look like proper seats. It looks like you can actually fit real human beings who have actual working legs in the back of this car. That's great. It means from a practicality perspective, you can definitely use this every day. Now, of course, the third thing is the Quattro system. All-wheel drive is something which I rave about on the channel, and it has plenty of naysayers. I know tons of people don't like all-wheel drive. much in the same way to those who don't like automatics. Any of you who follow my channel know that I love two things. I love automatics and I love all-wheel drive cars. Now, automatics, I've gone into a whole video of why I prefer those, but with all-wheel drive, that's more of a preference thing. It's a driving style choice. And yes, I chose the rear-wheel drive Jag, but in the case of this one, all-wheel drive, simply put, means that even though with 350 horsepower compared to, for example, my Jag's 420, this could easily still keep up with the Jag in real-world conditions, especially on twisty back roads, such as the ones that I'm driving on here. 0 to 60 is quoted at about 5.4 seconds. It is German though, so you should expect it to be a little bit quicker than that, and that is bang on right up there with the Jag. Technically a little bit slower, but again, for the power deficit, not much of a difference. It's also speed limited to 155, surprise surprise, and interestingly, there are some very notable changes between this two-door coupe, the hardtop version, and both the Sportback and, more applicably, the convertible. You would think that the convertible would, for obvious reasons, just be the same car with the ragtop. It really isn't. It has a totally different engine. Now, at least in this part of the UK, the southwest, such as where this car is based, I can't even tell you the last time I saw an S4 convertible. They are almost always the hardtop, at least of this era. And it's not hard to see why. It's the most pure driver's car of them all. That naturally aspirated V8 sounds amazing, as I said. The performance is so accessible. And it's not just the power. 350 horsepower is decent, but it has 325 pound-feet of torque as well. That's a really nice spread, especially for a naturally aspirated engine. The weight is not that high either, even though it has all-wheel drive. And speaking to the automatic versus manual debate, much like my car of the year 2021, the Volkswagen Golf R32, this also comes with the pleasing everyone options of both a manual and an auto. And once again, there's a difference between the coupe and the open top. The coupe comes with a 6-speed manual or a 6-speed auto with paddles. That's of course the one I'm using here. The open top comes with a 7-speed auto, and as I alluded to earlier on, a totally different engine. That one has a 3-litre supercharged 6-cylinder with about 330 horsepower. So very, very different car, which is an interesting choice to make it that much different to this vehicle. Now, one of the reasons why I think this car greatly benefits from having that Quattro system is, especially in the UK, if you once again compare it to something like the aforementioned Jag XK or the BMW 6 Series, be it, let's say, even the diesel versions that I talked about, which are tremendous GT cars despite running on diesel, which again is a controversial thing in its own right, but trust me, they are remarkably good cars. Well, this is the only one of those three which in UK form even has all-wheel drive. The Jag, of course, never does in any market. The BMW does in the foreign market, but not here in the UK as far as I can recall. And of course the Audi has it as standard. It's literally in the name. The difference is that, simply put, yes, it makes it easier for you. Yes, it's less tail-happy, which would for some people make it less fun, and it is more forgiving, which some people don't like. But if you want a car that has explosive performance, which you don't even have to think twice about using, something which pretty much will never break loose unless you push it to the absolute limit, and which essentially feels like you're driving a rally car when you do push it hard on a back road, well, despite having the 50, 70, even if you compare it to a 5-litre Jag XK, sometimes over 100 horsepower disadvantage, well over, it just doesn't feel like that in practice. It feels responsive, it feels planted, it feels like the grip will never run out. Now, in terms of pricing, at least here in the UK again, you can pay quite a varied amount, and this is one of the potential issues I think that the S5 has, and that is the kind of clientele who buy them. This is actually where it's a little bit closer to the BMW 6 Series than it is to the Jag, because with Jags, most XKs and XKRs especially don't tend to have crazy mileage. Some do, but most don't, because most tend to be treated as a sports car rather than a daily driver, even though that's what mine was. In the case of an S5, they tend to get driven a lot, so much more like my current Bentley, wherein finding a low mileage one is very difficult, and if you do, you'll be paying a lot more for it. Likewise with the S5, You technically can find one with maybe 40,000-50,000 miles on it, but even then that's a stretch, and that's not exactly low mileage. Now these ran from 2007 to 2016 in this form, and for that kind of range and for that kind of mileage range, you should be expecting to pay anywhere between $6,000 for probably a less than stellar one with very high miles, all the way up to technically 15,000-16,000 if you want to. And to give that a little bit of perspective, about £16,000 is interestingly where this car directly hands off the baton to the RS5, albeit very low-end RS5s with super high mileage, so it transitions fairly nicely into that higher 440 horsepower model, which of course is an entirely different beast in its own right. When it comes to this one, I would actually say that in summary, before we get into the potential issues which these can sometimes have and which you need to look out for when buying one, I would say that the way I would sum up the S5's driving style and experience is to say that, as I've kind of alluded to, it's the least Audi-esque easily of any Audi that I've driven. It has so much more charisma in particular. It's so much more playful. It's louder deliberately. It's more muscular in its approach. It just has more of that beefy bruiser mentality, and in that sense it actually is a fantastic little rival to something like the Jag XK. This does have more of a muscle car kind of feel to it than I would have expected, and I think it's actually all the better for it. It kind of reminds me in some senses actually of what I would typically expect from something more like a Mercedes AMG, except it doesn't have the disadvantage of just spinning up the rear tyres like an AMG typically would. I would say that this car is a really nice middle ground. It's not so crazy and so fast and so powerful that it's too expensive to buy a second-hand one, but at the same time, it's not boring. It's not a waste of time to purchase one, and it's not the kind of car that ever feels like it's going to be left behind by the competition. It's a very solid all-round choice, and it's not difficult at all to see why they're so popular, and why, at least from the cars that I've seen, this is by far the most common Audi S model that I ever see on the road. Not including RSs, just S4, S3, S5, that kind of thing. I see by far more S5s than anything else. The downside to that is that because so many people own them, and as I kind of referenced earlier on in the video, it's a different kind of clientele, you do need to take care that you buy a car that has been taken care of and wasn't purchased just by someone who wants to rag it everywhere. With that, of course, being the main downside, really, of accessible performance. If everyone who drives the car feels like they're a race driver, well, chances are they're probably going to abuse it and treat it as such, rather than being a little bit more cautious, such as you might be in something like an Aston or a Jag. Now, speaking to those potential issues, from what I could find online, and again, as I always like to say, if you are or were an owner of an S5, please feel free to drop your stories down below. It can certainly benefit other potential owners who might be looking up this video. The four most common things which I could find to look out for were, first of all, by far the most common, carbon buildup from the fuel injection, the FSI system. That seems by far and away the most common thing reported by owners, so check out receipts for that if it needs to be done, if it has been done already, how regularly, etc. The second thing is more so on the manual cars. Some of the early ones tend to have clutch issues, it would seem. Of course, not so much on the autos. And then the third thing is headlamp modules can sometimes have some issues. Again, you know, Volkswagen Group, Audi, Porsche, all that kind of thing. Not surprising to have some electrical issues here and there. In my own experience, that rings true even from non-Audis in that kind of sphere. And the final thing seems to be some control arm and bushing wear and tear, which needs to be swapped out. By far the number one to look out for, though, does seem to be that carbon buildup. Overall, though, the S5 is definitely a fantastic addition to the pool of cars which I've talked about in this kind of price and performance category. It can easily and should worry many of the other cars that I've talked about, definitely including the Jags, the Beamers, etc., because it is at least as good as them in many ways and has some of the key advantages, I would say, that I mentioned in this video. It's a good all-rounder, not a perfect car by any stretch, and it is definitely above all else a car that you will want to make sure has been treated well and taken care of. Doesn't mean you can't use it and use its performance, but don't necessarily buy it from a boy racer if at all possible. Ultimately, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, stick around on the channel for more, and if you want to check out my reviews for stuff like the 6 Series and the Gran Turismo and various others that I mentioned, of course the Jag, then you can find all of those here in the playlist on the screen as well. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.